aware that Ellie is a Green Herefordshire councillor, and you may also know that from July 2019 to January 2020, she serves the Green MEP for the West Midlands. We are, in fact, extraordinarily fortunate to have someone like with Ellie's expertise on our council, as she has had direct experience of the range of fields with which a council is concerned. So locally, she has been a primary school governor, a volunteer with Home Start and with Echo Herefordshire, which works to make a positive difference to the lives of people with disabilities in Herefordshire. She's been treasurer of a housing association. She spent 20 years working for charities and in higher education, including running health programmes for Christian Aid, coordinating a group of MPs in Parliament, tackling fuel poverty in East London, and supporting peace building in northern Uganda. This evening, she will be speaking about the climate emergency, and that isn't that isn't a merely local issue, but an international one. And well, as intimated already, here too, Ellie is very well qualified to understand the issues. She has a PhD in international development and has worked at the universities of Birmingham, Sheffield and Bath. In addition to her role at the Herefordshire Council Cabinet, she works part-time as a lecturer in the International Development Department of the University of Birmingham. And she writes, this is on the council, County Council website, she's put, "My cabinet portfolio, environment, economy and skills, connects with a wide range of topics that have long been close to my heart, including housing, transport, land use and job creation. I see my role as being about supporting a thriving, sustainable local economy that creates opportunities for everyone and reduces inequalities. At the same time, I'm deeply committed to reducing carbon emissions and maximising wildlife in our beautiful county. I am delighted to be part of this cross-party coalition administration, which is helping put Herefordshire on track for a brighter future with sustainability at its heart." So we're fortunate to have someone with that expertise on the council, and also very grateful to you for coming this evening to talk to us about how to put into practice a theoretical declaration of climate emergency. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Ruth. Thank you. Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. Isn't it nice to be together in a room? It's fantastic. So thank you so much to Friends of the Earth for organising this and inviting me along. And also massive thanks to all of you for kind of making it out on a Friday night to spend time here. As we said, I'm going to just I think I'll just do a bit of a fairly quick spiel, because then it's quite nice to have a dialogue so I can know what you're really interested in hearing about and respond to any questions you've got, or indeed suggestions, wisdom of the crowd and all of that. So I was asked to talk about kind of getting from the declaration of climate emergency to actual action on climate. I've been part of Herefordshire Council since 2017, initially in opposition and now as part of the administration. I've been in my cabinet role since February, March last year, just before lockdown, basically. Has been a bit of a weird 18 months, like it's for the council as a whole, like it has been for everybody. But I do feel that we are making, some real concrete progress. And I want to kind of pay tribute to three groups of people, actually, who are playing a role in that. And the first one is actually the officers of the council. They didn't just start doing stuff about climate when we all got elected 2 years ago. There's actually a really strong team that's been active on sustainability and climate change for a really long time, kind of working away in the background, kind of defending the space that they've got to work within what was going on previously. And in particular, doing those kind of, the win-wins, the things that could pay for themselves, the things like the LED street lighting and that sort of thing. So they've made really good progress towards reducing our carbon footprint already. They'd got down to nearly 50% reduction by the time that we got in. That's on a 2008-9 baseline, which is what what the council uses. So that's one bit of thanks, and they're kind of beavering away in the background, trying to deal with all of the demands that are coming into them as well. And I do just want to acknowledge that really hard work in delivering what we're demanding politically. The second kind of massive thank you is to any of you and anybody else who was outside the Shire Hall on that March the 8th, 2019, or who was part of the campaigns, who has been part of, Fridays for Future stuff, XR stuff, anything where you've been out on the street putting pressure on us as elected politicians, on other elected politicians as well, because that moment, that 8th of March, when we had that declaration of climate emergency, it was like, it really was, wow. It was such an example of people power in action. 400 people or something like that, kind of crowded outside and inside the Shire Hall. It just made it impossible for that motion not to be passed. And remember, it was a Conservative administration at that point. and some of them were saying, oh, well, I'm really not sure about this climate change thing, but they still voted for it. It was still unanimous. And so that was absolutely fantastic. And I also want to kind of really acknowledge the vision of people who kind of had the idea of doing those climate emergency declarations, because I've got a bit of a confession to make. When I first heard about it several months previously, I was kind of, a declaration, another pledge. What difference is that really going to make? More words. I was a bit sceptical, I have to be honest. And I am a complete convert now, because what it has done is give us the framework within the council to be able to say, yeah, but how does that align with our declaration of climate emergency? Our commitment, it's very firm, right? Net zero by 2030 is like, that's a hard deadline, that's a hard target, and it just gives us the framing to be able to make all of the action stuff happen. So that was really, really, really super important, getting that climate emergency declaration through. And it wouldn't have happened if it was just the politicians who were doing it. It happened because of people on the streets. And the third thank you actually is to my non-green colleagues and my green colleagues, but our coalition, right? So we are not a green administration, right? We're a coalition administration, and actually the independents are far larger than the Greens, but we have so much in common. It's so heartening to not be the only person in the cabinet room who's banging on about climate all the time, but to have my other colleagues saying, hang on, what about, let's consider this. So it really feels like a fully shared agenda. And indeed, not just our groups, there are some people in other political groups who also have strong personal commitment on climate and on biodiversity. Unfortunately, they don't quite always translate that into voting consistent with those principles. But, we've got a really sort of strong bedrock of cross-party support for action on climate change, which is so important. And it's a delight, actually. You said I was an MEP. One of the things I loved about that way of doing politics was that A, it was far more representative because it was proportional representation, and B, that generates a more cooperative form of politics. You literally were sitting down negotiating resolutions with people who were really quite different from you politically, and it was a really constructive mode of politics. And I feel that we're moving towards that a bit in Herefordshire because we are working so cooperatively. So that's the kind of the broad context. There are a load of people who are all the roots of all of the positive stuff that's happening in Herefordshire at the moment. And there's also the kind of big picture, which is like, oh my goodness, there's so much to do, and of course we aren't getting any of it done quick enough, and there's still a crisis, right? And actually being involved in politics is really interesting. Being involved in politics in administration is completely different from opposition. Opposition is kind of great because you just say what you want all the time and you kind of bang on. And being in administration is quite tricky because there's a lot of real practicalities to get to grips with, and budgets and competing demands and COVID and flooding and all sorts of unusual stuff. And it can be really tough. But it's also like it's the only place to be. I don't want to be on the outside kind of shouting. I want to be on the inside, wrestling with those things and trying to make the stuff done and trying to kind of push that space of what is possible forward a little bit. So I talked about how, officers and previous administrations had done stuff that was obviously going to save money and save a bit of carbon at the same time. That's all really good stuff, like the LED lighting. Now we are at the stage of saying, as a council, we recognise the long-term costs of not tackling climate change, and we're prepared to make decisions that will imply slightly increased short-term costs in order to do the right thing long-term. And a key example of that is just 2 weeks ago, we passed these new standards, Herefordshire Future Home standards, for the net zero affordable housing that we are going to start building as a council. And that is one example of how we're working differently as a council. There's been no social housing built in Herefordshire for a generation. It's a really cool commitment of ourselves as an administration to do that. And it's been very important to have the green voices in the room to say, yes, affordable and net zero, because it would be throwing good money after bad to build houses that weren't suitable for the net zero world that we have to be building. So I'm kind of really, really pleased to be sort of in there making those arguments. Sometimes it's difficult and sometimes it's surprisingly easy and you get things to change. So another example of that, of the kind of the easier stuff, is our COVID recovery plan. We're spending more than £6 million this year on COVID recovery things, lots of great stuff, supporting employment and supporting health and well-being, free swimming lessons and all of those sorts of things. And also supporting people to get into the towns to kind of help rejuvenate the high street and give people confidence to get out and about. And a lot of local authorities said, oh, well, the way that we'll do that is we'll just make car parking free. So that was the proposal that originally came forward from, I don't know who, an officer who was kind of drafting original proposals. And we said, that doesn't really compute with our commitment to sustainable transport, right? We shouldn't be subsidising car parking, which was free for a really long time during lockdown anyway. We should be putting that money into buses and bikes to help people to help achieve the same thing. And so that is why we've got the free weekend buses for the coming year. Yeah, that is why we've got more investment in expanding Beryl and so forth. So, and that was literally being the person, being in the room at the time and just saying, hang on, this doesn't quite compute. And you can change the way that £1 million is directed from something that doesn't contribute to building a net zero world to one that does. So, so that's really, really positive. There's two really big, chunky challenges for reducing our collective carbon footprints, and I'm talking for the county as a whole, not just for us as a council, because we can do bits ourselves to reduce our council carbon footprint. I said already that it was down to almost 50% by kind of last year, just over that. It's now down to 59.6% reduction. So we're on target for 75% by 2024/25 and zero, down to net zero by 2030. But that's, way less than 1% of the county's carbon footprint, right? There's a much, much bigger challenge there. And great if we build net zero housing ourselves, but what about the rest of the houses in the county, the new ones and the existing ones that are already leaking heat? So there's two big challenges, housing and transport, and I'll just say a wee bit about both of those. So on the housing front, first of all with new build. So quite early on we put in place climate and ecology checklists for any planning application. So this was to kind of just make every applicant jump through the hoops of kind of going through a list of prompts to think about how, what are you doing in terms of materials, insulation and all of these other aspects. Have you done the maximum that you can? That's a very kind of soft pressure, but it's it was what we could do then. Also said though, we want to kind of maximise our ability to use the policy space that we've got within the framing of planning law, which is actually pretty restrictive, unfortunately, But so we said, right, we want a supplementary planning document on environmental building standards. I read the draft of that a couple of weeks ago. It's really strong, it's really good. That is going out to consultation this autumn, and so that should, in a few months' time, be kind of passed and be part of our planning policy. Now, again, because of the way that planning law works, we can't kind of say, oh, right, all of you have just got to build to zero carbon standards right now. We just can't do that. But what we can do is say, you've got to jump through these hoops, you've got to show that you've considered these things and so forth. And then when we come to revising our local plan, which is the place where we really can shift the bar up, that's where we set our overall policy, we can build all of this stuff into it. So we are making sure there's one of these lists that I was given was, is your council making sure that it builds consideration of the climate emergency into everything that it does? Well, absolutely. The core strategy is so important to that. Spatial planning also has such a bearing on transport as well. So that's what that's an example of what we're trying to do with kind of new build. Retrofit is something that I have been slightly banging my head against a brick wall with for the whole time that I've been in this role, and we're still struggling with it. I have to be honest. It would be massively expensive to retrofit all of the houses in Herefordshire. We've got 85,000 homes in Herefordshire. We've got, I think it's the highest fuel poverty rate in the West Midlands, about 13%. We've got the oldest housing stock, I think, in the West Midlands. And we've got a lot of detached housing as well. And all of those things mean that we leak heat really badly. So we've got the average kind of rating of Herefordshire housing is quite a lot lower than the national average. So we have a big challenge, right? I'm sure you're all familiar with basically the failure of the Green Homes grants that the government tried to set up a little while ago and, put a very, very short time frame on, did eventually extend that, which was something that I was bending the ear of Robert Jenrick about when I met him last year about something completely different. But even that didn't help, right? Because there isn't the length of funding, the certainty of funding, there isn't the capacity within the industry to kind of use those funds to do the works. I tried to get somebody. The nearest place was in Ludlow, and they just didn't respond to my calls and emails. The next one after that was in Leicester. You can't, there isn't the retrofit industry that we need. So that needs long-term investment, and actually, eventually, it has to have central government investment because the scale of the challenge is so massive. But in the meantime, I really feel that we can't kind of just sit back from this. So we're putting money as a council into kind of, part of me thinks, writing yet another report on what we can do about this, but really trying to kind of investigate all of the possibilities, all of the potential funding streams. We've looked at a couple which I really hoped were going to have legs, and they don't, frankly. So it is a really big challenge, but not something that we're giving up on. And I kind of feel it's a really big prize as well, because these are high-skilled jobs, doing up these houses. This is really good for the planet, and it's good for the people who live in them as well, because what are we seeing at the minute? All of this panic about fuel prices and whether people are going to be able to keep warm through the winter. So I think a bit more progress perhaps on the kind of the new build policy stuff. Still really struggling with retrofit, but absolutely determined to try and get some movement on that. And then on transport, I mean, you all know the kind of the flagship change that we have made as an administration is we cancelled the bypass. That was, thank you, that was a really big decision. It was supported by, I think it's nearly 500 pages of report. It's really interesting reading, actually, when you look at it. And one of the really interesting things about that report, because, a proper review of all of the evidence had to be done. But of course, because we were a new administration and we were serious about acting on that climate declaration, we said, well, the criteria that you use for assessing all of these different options, climate has to be way up there. We actually had separate criteria for climate and environment. So they were properly weighted in the decision-making process when you were comparing and contrasting different transport options in a way that they just simply had not been before. So that's a kind of, I think that's quite a good example really of translating that broad declaration into very specific kind of terms of reference for a review of a project that, remember, was going to cost £200 million just to build the bypass. And what that review showed very, very clearly was that you could get the same amount of congestion reduction at a fraction of the price, about a third of the price, about 70 million. So that's really kind of really strong evidence. The challenge that we have now, having made that decision, is delivering on all of those other good things, because, of course, it's still £70 million that isn't floating around, certainly not at the moment. Government keeps on publishing fantastic, bus strategies and bike strategies and so forth, but there's not been any money associated with any of it. That's not my beeping. I was going to set myself an alarm to stop rabbiting on after 15 minutes, but I've just seen the clock, so I'll stop rabbiting on in a couple more minutes. Good reminder, thank you for that. So here are a few things that we're doing. So I've talked about the buses, right? Carpools. I'm a massive fan of carpools. I got rid of my car completely more than 18 months ago because we have a carpool where I live, and I'm complete convert. And so I've managed to get some funding again out of the COVID recovery funds in terms of, the rationale is helping people to get around more easily and more cheaply. And we're setting up 3 carpools in various locations across the county and funding them, hopefully, to each have an electric vehicle as well. On electric vehicles, we have a massive problem of lack of charging infrastructure, actually in the whole country, and we really have a problem in Herefordshire as well. We have been trying to resolve that. It's all a bit complicated, but it's still in process. But again, that is one of the things that we're really working hard on. Basically, we went out to tender for a project to do that, and we didn't get the bids in that were what we needed to actually deliver it. So now we're rethinking and going out to it. Absolutely has to happen. Don't even get me started on the problems of the incompatibility of all of these various different charging systems and how bonkers that is, and how it could have been solved if we'd managed to get kind of standardisation through the EU X years ago. But anyway, so that's it. EVs are part of the solution, but they're not the whole solution, because EVs still use up loads and loads of resources, don't they? There's still 3 tons of stuff, metal, to move around, kind of 70 kilos of person. So it's a wasteful way of getting people around, just one person in a car. My personal pet project that I still haven't managed to get off the drawing board, unfortunately, is actually, I think we need a kind of public service Uber thing, where you just use smartphones to kind of connect with your neighbours to find out, if somebody's driving down the road at the right sort of time. Can't be on a sort of, financial basis, but just on that building community and helping people to connect a bit better. Anyway, that's for another day. Walking and cycling infrastructure is a really big thing, and we have actually got a whole review going on now, Hereford City in particular, to look at the walking and cycling infrastructure and plan a proper network. I don't know about you, I cycle around in Hereford quite a bit. I drive the carpool EV to Ayleston Park and I park it there, and I use my Brompton bike or one of the Beryl bikes to kind of get around town. And the only nice bit to cycle on is basically the Greenway. The rest of it is really quite grim, isn't it? So we're really desperately in need. Even some of the more newly created kind of lanes across, along some of the roads, like out towards Tupsley. All it takes is a car to just park in the middle of the bike lane and you're stuffed. Of course, government helped and / didn't really help last year by bringing out this new guidance on creating bike lanes, LTM 120, which says that bike lanes have to be physically separated from the traffic. That is really good practice. It's really good for the cyclists. It's actually a bit of a pain when you've got bike lanes on the drawing board like we did have for St Owen Street that were designed according to the previous type of guidance and have now had to go back to the drawing board and therefore been delayed in actually being implemented. So again, that's one of those kind of, one step forward, one step back challenges that you face in administration that are really, really super frustrating. But you just have to kind of take a deep breath and hang on to the fact that it is still going to happen and it's going to be good when it gets there eventually. Buses, oh yes. So, and this will kind of take me on nicely to a couple of my final points. So, electric buses. I'm sure you've heard about these ideas of, the electric hopper buses. So this is a project that the town council, Hereford City Council, is putting forward as part of the town's fund. Okay, to have electric hopper buses doing several circuits around the city that people can kind of hop on and hop off. Brilliant, I think, because so many, that's the other thing about all of this data that was collected for evaluating the bypass. The vast majority of journeys are done inside the city or people coming in from the outskirts and then trying to get around within the city. So what we need is ways to get around within the city that aren't 3 tons of metal with one person inside. So I think those hopper buses are fantastically exciting. They'll be electric buses, they'll tackle the air pollution, but these things take a while to deliver, and that is frustrating. But if we weren't, I quite often come back to this thing of, if we weren't in power, would this stuff be happening? And I really don't think it would. One of the things that I feel good about that we've tried to do, kind of maybe a little bit more behind the scenes, is try and broaden the range of voices that are being heard in some of these key conversations about the future of the city. So, for example, with the Towns Fund, this is this £22.4 million of government money that we're going to get to invest in Hereford City. We kind of said, we don't want it just to be the usual suspects. So I said, I get to do this, right, because I'm Cabinet Member for Economy and it's technically in my portfolio. So I said, let's try and get a 50-50 gender balance on this board, shall we? Because basically everybody who'd put themselves forward previously was male and known, had served on previous boards, etc. So we just said that. And we said we want some young people on this board. And as a result, we had a much more diverse board than it would have been otherwise and that there was previously. And that board came up with a vision for Hereford City that says, our vision is to be the greenest and fairest, basically. It's that greener and fairer language is kind of really embedded in there. And I'm not sure that would have happened previously either. We're putting our own money as a council into the market towns because, it's not fair if Hereford City gets all of the money. There's a hell of a lot of people who live outside in the market towns and the rural areas in between. So we're putting our own money into that. And again, saying that, that needs to be work that contributes to building the zero carbon county that we're trying to become. We are setting up a county-wide climate and nature partnership, trying to bring in stakeholders from all sorts of, big emitters as well as kind of community activists to help drive forward this broader work. We've put money, our dividend that we get from the energy company that Herefordshire that the council buys its energy from, we've put that into a climate reserve. And one of the things that we're funding out of that now is a new community grants scheme for small-scale community projects that are tackling, again, climate and nature emergency. We are just about to commission a big comms campaign to build on the broader conversation that's going to be going on around COP26 to engage, the wider community and thinking, right, what can we do in Herefordshire itself? And I had one final point that's gone completely out of my head. I don't know why I'm looking at Tony. You don't know what I wrote in my laptop. But I think I will stop there. And, how could I forget? We're going to have a climate assembly in January in partnership with the organisation Sortition, who do these things using the sortition method properly. So it's a properly representative sample. And it's actually being conducted as part of our annual budgeting process. Because that's another thing I've learned being in politics. It's all very well having the kind of, the fancy ideas and all of the rest of it. But actually, it's where the money goes that kind of determines what happens. And the reality in councils across the country is there's basically almost zero wriggle room in revenue budgets. They have been so shaved over the last 10, 11 years, so shaved, cut to the bone. But there is more wriggle room in capital budgets. So that's where we can do things like, say, we're going to invest in cycle paths instead of car parks or whatever. Or we're going to set these conditions around the stuff that we build with the capital budget. Every project that puts forward an outlined business plan now has to have an environmental and climate and nature impact section to it. Every council decision now has to have a climate and nature section to it. And now we're integrating this into the budgeting process, both broadly and with this climate assembly. And what I am very, very much hoping, this isn't kind of written in stone or anything yet, but we are aiming to allocate a chunk of money and to say we want to know what the local, a good significant chunk of money, and to say, right, we want to know what the people of Herefordshire, as represented by this assembly, think the priorities are. So it wouldn't just be an assembly that comes up with ideas, but an assembly that comes up with proposals that we will, as an administration, support at the budget meeting that follows shortly thereafter. So that participatory budgeting, you know, they've done it brilliantly in Porto Alegre for many years. They've tried it in all sorts of other places. I'm really excited that we're trying it in Herefordshire, and it's another example, I think, of our commitment to just trying to do politics a little bit differently. I have rabbited on. I'm going to stop. But I'd love to take questions or comments or suggestions. Yeah. Thanks.
Who would like to ask the first question?
I wasn't expect to be asking the first question, so I've been able to thought it out very long yet. I'm very pleased we've got the climate change compliance checklist and the biodiversity checklist. I noticed on our parish council, which is Foundhope, we have people putting in applications and they don't complete the checklist. So at the moment, our chair has said, well, if they haven't completed the checklist, we'll say, that's not good enough. But it tends to be ignored, and for years our neighbourhood plan is being ignored, particularly by developers. That's one thing. The other thing that I'm particularly concerned with, probably mentioned to you at some point, that when we look at the plans from developers and they have patio doors facing northeast, for instance, and I've been trying to say, well, get the orientation right. It's all in our neighbourhood plan, but the developers take no notice, and we cannot, and they sort of come at you with a done deal, really. So it's very. They don't change, whatever the comment, but parish council got no power, it seems. And I feel frustrated that the planners in Hereford don't pick it up either. Clearly the designs, to my way of looking at it, it's just not good enough. They don't have to be zero carbon, but they might at least face the right way, you know.
Yeah.
It's basically south. And not southwest, which is an overheating situation quite often. So it's quite, there's no awareness from developers. Are the planners, I think maybe the question is, are the planners changing?
That's a great question. So the question, I'm just repeating it for the camera. Look at that, Clive. I remembered to repeat it for the camera. So the question is around, the very specific question is, are the planners in Herefordshire Council changing? And more broadly, what influence can we actually have on developers, in particular, big developers? You're absolutely right that with things like the checklist, there's a kind of, a slight sort of moral push to it, but there's no strong, there's no kind of legal weight to it, right? And that if there is a powerful developer, too often they can bulldoze through, essentially, and argue that other concerns outweigh the sorts of concerns that you're raising or that your neighbourhood plan raises. I talked about kind of the ratcheting up. So the checklist was the sort of first stage. The supplementary planning document is the second, and then the core strategy is the third, and they're in ascending order of kind of weight. So the SPD, the supplementary planning document that should be finalised by the end of this year thereabouts, The very first chapter of that is on building orientation. It's kind of the most fundamental thing. And building materials and, all of these things, and where you put the windows and all of these things. Because I completely agree, and it takes me on to a little mini anecdote, if you'll forgive me. But one of the very early cabinet meetings that I went to, early last year in early lockdown, was looking at a proposal to build a new block in a school. So this was Herefordshire Council building a new school building at quite a considerable cost. And I read the papers, because I do like to read the papers at the meetings that I'm supposed to be making decisions at. And I was quite horrified to see that there was a plan of the school grounds, and there were 3 different locations where this new block could be. And they were all kind of completely randomly orientated. No consideration whatsoever had been given to building orientation. And I basically threw my toys out of the pram in a very nice way, but I said, this isn't good enough. This document sort of talked about, we'll aspire to BREEAM good standards, which is nowhere near good enough. And so as a result, we got that particular building improved to BREEAM excellent, unfortunately not to passive house, but out of that conversation, we've got a policy that all new schools in Herefordshire will be built to passive house standard as a minimum. So, we can do that ourselves. Getting other people to do it is harder, and it's going to take things like the SPD, but also changing the core strategy to tighten up the language in there, because the existing core strategy has got some quite nice warm language about, climate change is terribly worrying, but it hasn't got enough oomph, and we're just not able to change planning. We're not able to change national planning law, and we're not able to change our own planning policy even that quickly. In terms of whether the planning officers themselves are kind of using the maximum leeway possible within, the policy that we've got, I honestly don't know. I really honestly don't know. My colleague Liz Harvey has recently taken over as Cabinet Member for Planning, and she has a commitment to detail. So I expect that she'll be looking into that in quite a lot of depth. But yeah, I can kind of only apologise really for when we don't manage collectively as a council to just do as well as we might, and just say we're trying. And when there are specific examples, please, it is what we're here for. Write to us and complain about them. And sometimes we can get stuff done, and quite often we can't really very much, but we can try at least.
I think it's early days. I mean, these plans have been around for several years, but they're just coming into, they haven't been built yet, so they're sort of, but they were there before the change in council.
Yeah, and exactly. There's an inertia, isn't there, to big projects in particular, and of course, big developers are going to be, taking a long time. We took over, and there were projects that we were kind of taking over responsibility for, that the council itself was building, that weren't up to the standards that we would have liked, but we weren't able to do anything about them then. So there is a kind of, what's that saying about, grant me the serenity to accept the things I can't change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. So quite a lot of politics is like that, really. Yeah. Thanks for the question.
Any other questions?
There's a couple of... Oh, no.
Put this one first.
Oh, hi there.
Hiya.
I just wondered if there are any plans to put any resources into helping people change from a meat and dairy-based diet to a more plant-based diet, and helping people to understand how they can do that, and information and campaigning like that.
Yeah.
It is one of the biggest emitters, the consumption, the production of meat and dairy.
Yeah, you're right. It is a significant part of carbon footprints. I mean, in Herefordshire, the carbon footprint is very, it is very clear that housing and transport are the key big things, but diet is a part of it, certainly. I think that's something where there's slightly less leverage on the part of a council, you know, we don't build infrastructure that determines what people eat, for example, but we do potentially have areas of influence. So, for example, schools, what schools feed kids, in the care sector. So it's, you know, almost entirely private care homes, but quite a lot of care places are funded by the council. So perhaps we could have some influence over that. And there is actually a sustainable food strategy that is kind of in draft form. It's actually held in the public health team. So not in the kind of sustainability and climate change team, but there have been conversations going on about it. I have to confess to you, it's one of those things that I've kind of been aware of, but haven't managed to get the time to really get my teeth into personally. But I'll make a commitment to kind of follow that up. If you want to email me as well, that'll help me remember to look into it and kind of just, because sometimes it's just a question of asking, oh, what's happening with this? You know, could we make this come forward? Can we kind of, you know, really encourage this? And on the kind of broader question of dietary choice and the impact that that has on carbon footprint, it is something that's covered by our Zero Carbon Herefordshire website. You know, it's one of the aspects that is mentioned, both what you choose to consume and also what you waste. So yeah.
I think that's a good idea, and I mean, what I would like to see happening is somehow a team of people, maybe volunteers, coming together to work with someone at the council who perhaps could help people give information and perhaps visit care homes. And I had a relative recently in a care home, and there was no, you know, there was no choice really on that front whatsoever. I just think there's a lot of work that needs to be done, and I think a lot of people want to make the change, you know, in part anyway, but they just need help to do it. And it's just working out how we can do that. But
yeah.
Maybe I can send you an email, and if there's any scope in the future, perhaps.
Absolutely.
Do something. I'd be willing as a volunteer to do something. On
Thank you. Thank you. Like I say, you know, public health are really interested in this, and it's kind of, you know, it has been on their agenda. I think it's just that public health have been completely overwhelmed with something else for the last 18 months, and some of this stuff has been inevitably deprioritised.
Yeah,
but
I myself was in hospital last year, but unfortunately it wasn't in Hereford, but there was nothing on the menu really that wasn't meat or dairy based. They did make things for me because I asked for it, but I just think more needs to be done for everybody, you know, visiting hospitals and whatever. But anyway, thank you.
Thank you. I forgot to reproduce the question, didn't I, Clive? So anyway, it was about food and food choices. Yeah.
I think there was another question, yes.
Could you talk about COP a little bit more, Ellie, and any sort of any plans the council have to A, inform the people of Hereford that COP is happening, and B, what it's all about? I hear that you're going, and what your role is going to be in COP, because I think it's a huge opportunity for everybody to actually get behind the green agenda, countrywide, probably globally, actually. So
yes,
there'll be a lot of attention there.
Yeah. So there is some work going on within the council's comms team on messaging around COP. So there is a plan to do some local messaging around that. What I was hoping was that we would have this communications contract in place before COP, so that, you know, we're going to use external expertise. There's some amazing comms agencies, fantastic people rooted in Herefordshire and more broadly, but, you know, we have a social value procurement thing now, so we do look to kind of spend money in the local economy if we possibly can. I was really hoping we would have that in place before COP, and I don't think we're going to, I have to be honest, which is a big disappointment. At the same time, the way that what I'm telling myself to feel a little bit better about that is that there's going to be wall-to-wall national media coverage around COP in those first 2 weeks of November anyway. And maybe, you know, the opportunity for us is the kind of the messaging that comes a little bit after that, because COP will again help to sort of, you know, shift the window of perception around this, and then we can come in afterwards saying, yes, locally, remember this is what you can do, you can get involved with these things. And then in January, our citizens' assembly and the participatory budgeting I think that's actually quite good timing, because probably in the second half of November, everybody will be a bit like, tell me something about Strictly, I've heard enough about COP. And so, in January we can say, new year, new budgeting, here's a real opportunity to kind of get involved and have a say. Right. So, yeah, not perfect, I'm afraid, but we are doing some stuff about it. At the same time, I know that like in Ledbury, there's a kind of bunch of people in the community planning to do some sort of pop-up shop thing around COP, and all of that community stuff is brilliant. And more and more I kind of think about all of the different parts of the movement trying to take us in the right direction. I kind of like to think of it as an ecosystem. So not it's not about it always has to come back to the council that's kind of got a directing role or knows exactly what's going on or whatever. It's brilliant that there's all of these different bits and pieces happening, and fantastic if we can connect them together, if that happens organically or if there's some way of supporting it. So we've got this grant scheme at the moment. So that's, if there's a community group that wants to do stuff around COP, there's a grant scheme. You can apply for up to 15 grand to do good stuff, right? So, that's quite nice that that's there. So it doesn't have to be the council that's doing the communications. And quite often it might be other people that are better placed to do that. So, the great collaboration, the parish councils have done some fantastic work on this as well. Yeah.
I also want to say thank you very much for everything you're doing. It's great. I know I quite often sort of am on the couch listening to the council meetings with Tony, and I know that you do an incredible amount of work, so thanks to all of you.
Thank you. It's a collective. Yeah, thank you.
Was there another question this time? Yes.
Hi, so two bits to this really. So where is the council up to with the Beige Court legislation and the appeal we've been going through? And what's the council doing to support regenerative farming to change farming practices?
Okay, so the questions were, one, where's the council up to with Beige Court, which is was a court case, and the other one is, what's the council doing to support regenerative farming practices? So on Beige Court, actually, I don't know if an appeal has been lodged against that, has it? Already? Okay, I'm sorry, I'm not fully up to date with that. But basically, local campaigners took the council to court for, in their argument, not fully applying the legislation on habitats protection in the case of a planning application from a farmer in the Golden Valley. And the court actually ruled in favour of the council and said that the officer did act properly. So that's now another active court case. So I'm sure I probably shouldn't comment on it anyway, but I mean, other than to repeat what I'd said publicly, which is that my Green colleagues on the planning committee voted against that in the first place, and I'm sure I would have done as well if I'd been on that committee. But, planning law is planning law, as we were talking about earlier, and testing it in the courts is one way to do that. I don't know if this is the best case for campaigners who are trying to do that, if it's the clearest cut case, but anyway, that's where it is. Regenerative agriculture. So when my colleague, Felicity Norman, who I'm sure lots of you know, Green councillor in Leinster, organised a visit to Richard Thomas's farm the other day up at Risbury, which was absolutely fantastic, looking at what he's doing around regenerative agriculture. And various colleagues from within the coalition came along, as well as all sorts of other people. Farming is quite interesting for the council because we don't have a direct role. So we don't run farms ourselves anymore. They were all sold off. We don't regulate farming, and that is a very sore point because we are picking up the pieces from the effects of phosphate pollution of the River Lug, which means that there is a planning moratorium, which means nobody can build houses in basically most of North Herefordshire, and that has been there for virtually 2 years now. And that's seriously problematic for anybody who wants to build a house, and also for the council as a whole, because we do want to enable people to build houses in Herefordshire. You know, more houses are needed in the country, and we want people, you know, to be able to have them in the right place, the right circumstances in Herefordshire too. So that moratorium is really something that has been bothering us very seriously right from the start, and we have been working our little socks off basically for 2 years to try and resolve that. Very frustratingly, because of course we don't regulate agriculture, the Environment Agency does. They have no boots on the ground because they've got no money. So, you know, eventually, so we've been kind of, you know, kicking up a fuss and trying to get people involved, and the Nutrient Management Board is chaired by Herefordshire by my Conservative colleague Alyssa Swinglehurst, who is somebody that I do want to pay tribute to, as somebody who is very personally committed on biodiversity issues, and, you know, really has been kind of trying her best along with others to try and bring people together to resolve this. A little bit more money was announced by the government a few months ago for more Environment Agency staff. I think it was 100 across the whole country, and that translates into 1.5 in Herefordshire. There's been no prosecutions. So, and yet 2/3 of the pollution in the River Wye, according to the Environment Agency's agreed statistics, agreed under the Nutrient Management Plan, is from agricultural pollution. So we have a really serious problem there, and a key part of that is intensive poultry units, which is a really, really long way from regenerative agriculture. So we have quite a lot of conversations about farming, but they tend to be specifically around IPUs and phosphate pollution in the Lug and in the Wye. We are kind of trying to build relationships as well with the farming stakeholders, because, you know, a really, really large chunk of Herefordshire land is farmed. There's actually a lot of farmers like Richard who are actually really wanting to go in a different direction, and it was so interesting to hear him talking about his personal journey of kind of, you know, 6 years ago, kind of just getting fed up with the old way that he'd been doing, his family had been doing, and actually deciding to try a bit of a different path. And it's a bit like, it's very much like actually what James Rebanks describes in his books about the kind of, the industrialisation and mechanisation of agriculture, and the sort of, the sucking of the life out of the land, essentially, through that form of agriculture, and the regeneration of it as a new generation of farmers comes through and thinks, yeah, we'd really like to do something differently. So some of that is happening. It's quite hard to see what the council's role can be. If I'm perfectly honest, the council has way too much to do already. Care and transport and housing and all of these other things. And we don't have any direct levers other than, I suppose, encouragement. So every time we meet with the NFU and we bang on about climate and biodiversity, that's part of it. Every time we meet with the Country Landowners Association, that's part of it. And we're actually in quite a few of the same sorts of, all of those stakeholders sit in things like the Nature Partnership and the Climate Partnership and those sorts of things. So we're trying, but I don't know how we can more directly lever that, to be honest.
Can I just add to that a little bit? First of all, I make a plug for James Rebanks. I just read English Pastoral, whatever. It's a brilliant book. This came out last year, and about the way farming in his family has changed and so on. But it's well worth the read. There is somebody. Has Richard Thomas? A question. Has Richard Thomas got a website?
Don't.
Yes.
I don't think so, no.
Because I've just found out, I'm talking to the CPRE chap who recently about the river and all that, but he said, I was talking about regenerative farming, he said, do you know about Regen Ben?
Oh yes, I've seen him do a talk.
And he has got a website, so if anybody wants to have a look, he's at Brampton Abbots, just outside Ross on Wye. And he is has done an awful lot of reading as well. He's a practical farmer, got a couple of 100 acres, and you can go on farm visits. Starting in May again, they've just finished for this year, and he's read a lot of books, and he does a little review of them as well. But it's well worth a look at the website. If you just put in to Google Regen, R-E-G-E-N, Ben, it comes up, and yeah, I was very impressed.
Brilliant. I'll just repeat that for the camera. So Regen Ben, if you Google that, it's a great site for information on what this guy Ben, I've forgotten his surname, is doing in regenerative farming. Yeah. Anyway, in Herefordshire near Ross.
That's a rather question. That's all of other hand already. Yes.
I'm never normally listening to councillors, so I have to say I've been delighted to hear what you're going to say tonight from someone in the future, and delighted to hear the breadth of your ambitions, which is very heartwarming. My question is a bit more localised than most of the things. It's to do with the old bridge and its closure. I thought when the council decided to close it, it was a very brave and excellent high-profile move, because the old bridge, a bit like the old house, is very much representative of Hereford. I live in St Martin's Street, which is the far side of the bridge, and I very much lived in heaven. Hasn't stopped all the traffic, of course, but it certainly controlled it a lot. And I'm just wondering if there's any chance that it might get closed again in some degree. I've been very much in support. You do.
Thank you. I've personally really enjoyed cycling across that bridge without taking my life into my hands with traffic as well at the same time. We have to reopen it because it was closed under COVID rules, basically. So there's just no choice about reopening it. I do know that John Harrington, who is the Cabinet Member for Transport, really likes it being closed and has had lots of really positive feedback, not just from residents, but local businesses as well, about the positive impacts of that bridge being closed. So I can't speculate long term, but I suggest that you write to John Harrington expressing your views, because the more he hears from people who have, informed opinions about things and, a relevant voice, it's just really helpful in decision making. So, and you can find his email address on the council website. Sorry, I forgot to repeat the question. It's clear from what I'm saying? Okay.
Well, to say which bridge it was.
It's about the old bridge, about the closure of the old bridge under the COVID rules, so that it became kind of pedestrians and cyclists and stuff. Yeah.
So further to that, can I just comment that last October we did a whole day, 2 days work on the old bridge. We did a lot of talking to people, and we had an active travel school as Friends of the Earth with help from other organisations. So we've done a lot of work which we've given to the council. So they've had all that information, and my understanding is that there was work that could have been done in that year by our council officers to get an application in so that it could be a permanently closed route, just like Monmouth Bridge was closed and made Monmouth a much more pleasant place. And I'm very disappointed it's not happened. I've cycled up from Hunterton, where I live, this evening, and I hadn't remembered that it was now going to be open from October the 1st, and I nearly had a very nasty accident turning onto it as a blind bend. Okay, so not only has it been opened, it hasn't had any warning for cyclists that it is now open to traffic, which is not brilliant.
No.
I'm very disappointed, and I think that we, on this occasion, have not been well served by our council officers. So I hope that that is followed up.
Yeah. Can I request that you write to John just to tell him that? Yeah.
I do have the ear of council.
I know. You've got the inner voice. Yeah. I always wonder what to do when I hear complaints about the council, because it's quite interesting when you're in the position of, you're technically responsible, right? But you don't want to defend the indefensible. So But then it must feel kind of quite unsatisfactory for somebody to make a complaint and then to hear, yeah, you know, I hear what you say. But I can't promise for it to be different. And one of the reasons I can't promise for it to be different is because we basically don't have anywhere near the number of staff that we need to do this stuff. So, you know, one of the things that's going on behind the scenes in the council is there's actually quite a lot of internal change. We've got a new chief executive, came in May. He's actually really good. I'm really, really pleased. He's incredibly hardworking, very focused, very, very committed, decisive, just kind of cuts through stuff, but also it really feels like he's committed to helping us achieve our vision for the county, what we're trying to do. And we didn't really have that before. But there's also, you know, a sort of percolating down process of change in how the council is working. And part of that is enforced by budget cuts. So all of us in the administration, we're completely anti-austerity. And yet we found ourselves in the last year budgeting process having to find £11 million of savings on a £160 million base budget. And in the context of the fact that most of that, or a disproportionate amount of that, came from economy and place, which is the bit that deals with transport and potholes and planning and bins and basically absolutely everything that the vast majority of residents see face to face. That's all economy and place. And it used to have a budget of about 30 million, and it's now got a budget of about 25. Because 2/3 of the money goes on adult social care and children safeguarding. And that is, you know, not always understood. I know that you absolutely understand this, Maggie, but, you know, so much of what the council tax and the business rates and the little bit of money that we get from central government goes on is that stuff behind the scenes that actually only directly affects quite a small proportion of the county's population. And it does mean, because all of that is statutory requirements as well, if we need to find £11 million of savings, then half of that basically has to be found from economy and place, the bins, the potholes, the transport, you know, all of those things, the planning, all of those things that are facing the general public. So I kind of, you know, I honestly feel quite stuck sometimes because, yeah, I completely agree with you. And partly it's like, actually, how expensive is it to just tell people that this road reopening is coming? How expensive is it to put a sign up there? You know, is it really about money? Or is it about priorities? And without knowing what that officer was prioritising in terms of something different, it's hard to know. You know, it might have been safety stuff outside a school, or it might have been something completely irrelevant to safety, in which case it shouldn't have been prioritised. I really don't know.
I think that was pretty basic. I don't think there'd be many things that could have been prioritised more than, you know, warning cyclists that there is no traffic, two-way traffic that you're going to hit. It's the care and attention, I think. I'm quite disappointed about that.
Understood. I'm sorry.
I don't feel I've been keeping a track of who's, do you know whose hand, your hand was up for, was it her hand was up for?
We'll get them all in, don't worry. I'll make my answers shorter so we can get in more questions.
Okay, I just wanted to come back to the planning issue again. Where are things at with the 10% net gain in biodiversity? I've seen it in the planning application recently, and I was expecting to see something about habitat creation in there, and all I saw were more bird boxes and bat boxes. So I just couldn't see how it translated into anything concrete, and I wondered where things are at and in what way that's going to be implemented.
Yeah. So my understanding, and I might be a wee bit behind the times, and you might even know more about this than me, Tony, but I'll embarrass myself publicly first and then you can fill in the gaps. So my understanding is that we don't yet have the policy guidance from central government about that. So we are waiting for kind of clarity about how we translate that into what we do in planning, and we're also waiting for there was promised central government funding to help us deliver biodiversity net gain. So I think that's one of those things that's still, waiting for more movement from central government, who in fairness have also had quite a bit on their plate, like giving contracts to their friends and so forth. But yeah, I think it's all a bit pending. Everybody knows it's coming, but not fully I's dotted and T's crossed. Are you going to correct me, Tony?
No, that's my understanding of it as well, is that it's in the pipeline. It's just one of those things, like the Environment Bill, that hasn't quite come into fruition.
Mm-hmm.
It was just interesting, though, that it was actually in the application. I read it. So that's what made me think, perhaps it has come in.
I think people know it's coming, and it's a bit like, people know the sorts of words to put in to make it sound good, but then, of course, it's devil is in the detail, Yeah, is that just a bat box, or actually, are you thinking a bit more seriously about it? Nothing against bat boxes, but yeah.
You used the phrase informed opinion, and I'm thinking in terms of the Climate Assembly. Is it going to be like ones I've read about nationally, where they have a sort of educational element before they actually advise? Because there's so much prejudice, isn't there, these days at work now about transport issues, for instance. There's kind of culture wars thing going on. It's just so obvious in the Hereford Times letter page. So it becomes so emotive, doesn't it? And so presumably, if the Climate Assembly is democratically selected, a representative sample, then it will include some of those people who have those sort of are on that side of the culture war. And I think the strength of the Climate Assembly would be that it is representative, and so if they are recommending policy, that's great, isn't it? Because the council can then have got a real justification to go ahead with that. But I'm a bit worried that if people who have very reactionary sort of pro-car views are part of that, but unless they have a lot of new information, that you could actually get some skewed policies.
Okay, thanks for the question. So the question was about the Climate Assembly in January and whether it'll have a strong educational element to it, or whether it might just kind of amplify existing disagreements and entrenched positions. And it's a really easy answer. It's going to have a really big element of kind of informing people, presenting of evidence. Yeah. So it's actually going to involve 30 hours of commitment on the part of each participant. Yeah. So there's going to be quite a lot, and some of that, I believe, I don't know all of the ins and outs, but I think some of it is stuff that you kind of read yourself in advance by yourself. Some of it's sessions where people talk with you, and it's evenings and weekends, and all of this sort of. So it's much more like the National Climate Assembly that was done last year in Birmingham is much more like that, a real process of deliberation, which is what climate assemblies, citizens' assemblies are supposed to be like. So they have these two key features. One is selection through sortition, so that you get that representative sample. In Herefordshire, we actually have quite high election turnouts, but we still get less than 80% turnout at a general election and less than 50% turnout at a local election. With sortition, and they're a self-selecting bunch of people, right? With sortition, you are identifying people who represent all of this kind of diversity of population groups. So that's the plan, that you're really getting everybody together in the room. And because it isn't just, an argument in the pub or in the letters page of the local paper, which, yes, is one forum, but probably not the most productive and constructive forum for dialogue. A citizens' assembly creates this real opportunity to for everybody to consider the same evidence and discuss why they might interpret it differently or prioritise things differently. And looking at the results of the National Citizens' Assembly last year, I mean, that was really interesting because there was a kind of chunk of people, you know, a lot less than 10%, who were really quite resistant to a lot of stuff, you know, just, yeah, I want to fly anywhere I want, whenever I want, and drive anything I want, whenever I want. But the really, really large majority of people understood the evidence and kind of responded to that. And I think it could actually be something that really helps us to get beyond the kind of, you know, some of the stuff, like around the bypass, people still do bring up the bypass, and it's totally not evidence-based. The bypass. I mean, any project can be revived by a future administration. You know, if you want to keep the bypass off the agenda, then you need to keep electing green and kind of independent councillors, right? Sorry, shameless plug. But you know, I mean, anything can happen. People can build anything. People could build flipping HS2, you know, endless extra runways and so forth. Well, that was always one of the issues originally, wasn't it? You know, yeah, where do you find £200 million from? And wouldn't you be better off spending it on something a little better?
You're not going to give it to us to spend on cycle paths and things, presumably.
Well, this is the, you know, those funds aren't available at the moment. You know, government makes these warm noises about, you know, bus back better and so forth. Where's the hard cash? You know, that is... So there is a really big job to do to hold government to account for its commitments. And actually, you asked me, I am going to COP26, and I'm not going with any big organisation or agenda. I'm going to meet up with some Greens. I'm going to kind of tag along and find out who's on the street and what they're doing. And I'm just going because I've got a friend in Glasgow, so I can kip on the floor for free. And I just kind of feel I want to be there and be part of holding the government to account. You know, even if they're not listening, but you know, they've got to listen if we're paying attention, essentially. You know, it's like outside the Shire Hall. You know, you don't know that people are going to listen until you create so much pressure that they actually have to. And we have, you know, increasing quantities of warm words / hot air from Johnson's government, right? But we still don't have the money behind it. We really don't. So, you know, and they're not going to put the money behind it unless we continually defeat Tory councils and put in place an alternative that says these are the priorities, unless we defeat Tory MPs and Tory governments and say, you know, you've got to put your money where your mouth is and actually take those decisions that might seem difficult, but actually, if we've learned anything in the last 18 months, it's that money can be found when there is a need, right? And yeah, coronavirus was just hit us head on like that. Had to be a really rapid response. But the climate emergency is, you know, it is useful terminology to call it an emergency. It is concentrating minds. And that's what has to happen because, I mean, I don't know about all of you, but, you know, I've been involved in climate stuff since I was a teenager, and that is now shockingly 30 years ago. And I do see some progress, you know, and it gives me hope when we have Greens in power because we didn't have that 30 years ago. And it gives me hope when we have, you know, unanimity around the principles, but there's still such a long way to go to translate it into practice. But yeah, don't worry about the Climate Assembly. I think, but you know, if we believe that we are right? If we believe that we are evidence-based, then we shouldn't be afraid of putting the evidence in front of people, right? I think you're right. You shouldn't, you know, you don't want to create a forum that's basically just a slanging match very briefly between people who will get entrenched in their positions. But that's the whole thing about a Climate Assembly. It's a much more in-depth process than that, and I think really constructive. Yeah. Thanks.
A few more questions. How many? Please put up your hand. How many more questions are there that people are waiting to ask? 1, 2. Well, let's have those two. Yes.
And I'm really not offended if people want to go. Like, just sneak out. It's fine. Well, you know, I understand there's. It's fine. Thanks.
I'm really reassured by it all.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Oh, good. Thank you.
You have these questions. You have a question?
Yes, mine is at a very micro level, but it's about verges.
Okay.
And people mowing their verges, so around us it's looking more like Tunbridge Wells or Herefordshire. I don't suppose there's anything much that, I do try and talk to my neighbours about it, but they say, well, it's only this much, it doesn't matter. And of course, if you add up all the this much is, it means that vast quantities of our verges are being mown to,
Yeah. Well, I think you're very unlucky because you must be in a not spot for some of the really exciting stuff that is actually happening. Have you come across Verging on Wild?
No.
Okay. So anybody Verging on Wild? So Verging on Wild is a community group that... Are you involved? Yes. So yes. Go on. Sally, hello. Yes. No, well, I can't. You can tell it much better than I can.
Yes, but I would have raised the same issue.
Okay.
So it's not about the special verges, it's about the extent to which householders and landowners are beginning to mow verges, not just in front of their houses, but either side, across the other side of the road, saying, oh, we've asked the farmer. They don't, it's not in their gift to actually say, oh, you can mow there.
Yeah.
So I'm very much on the same page.
It's because it looks neat.
Yeah. So I think that is a wider educational thing, and hopefully it's something that we can do with the communications work that I was talking about us starting off. That's got quite a strong climate focus, but we've as a council we've said we recognise it's an interlinked climate and ecological emergency, and we're treating this stuff together. We're also doing work on a nature strategy, and that's clearly something that's kind of going to be relevant to that. So if it's council verges, I actually think things are moving in the right direction, because Verging on Wild has been doing excellent work with parish councils and also liaising with Balfour Beatty and so forth, and Balfour Beatty has changed the way that they're doing stuff, and if there's more specifics that we can ask them, fantastic. If it's kind of individual Herefordians thinking that looks a wee bit mucky over there, then it is actually about neighbourly conversations as well. I know that's tricky. Yeah. But so there's loads of research. It's actually one of the things that made me get involved in politics. There's loads of research that shows that what changes people's mind is one-to-one conversations. Loads of research on that. So people who are, really homophobic, having their minds changed by having a conversation with a gay person and completely changing their views, that sort of thing. Lots of psychological research around that. And, the council can put out any number of leaflets and tweets and stuff that it likes about, don't mow verges that don't belong to you. But those individual conversations make a real difference. I'm not saying you specifically with your neighbour who might be it might be tricky or whatever. Yeah. But that thing about talking about stuff that you believe in really has an effect, and it's something that we all can do. So I used to kind of shout at the radio and, talk to the person I lived with about what I thought about politics. And then I got involved in politics because I thought, I can't only shout at the radio anymore. I need to kind of get out there. And so getting involved in politics, you go around and you knock on people's doors, and some of them tell you to go away, but quite a lot of them are very happy to talk to you about the things that are really important to them. And then in return, they're quite interested in listening to you about why you're not, what on earth motivates you so much that you're knocking on their door. And that changes people's minds. So, sorry.
Who owns the verge, as it were?
It's different in different places. So different bits of verge are owned by, some bits are owned by the council, some bits will be owned by private owners.
It's my understanding that, I know it does vary, but that the farmer, the adjacent farm or landowner, owns the substrate underneath, but the responsibility for management is within the public domain. But it does vary. I know some bits definitely belong to farmers where, for example, the council has asked on the corner for the hedge to go back, and then they haven't actually bought that piece of land. I remember as Virgin on Well, we had a response to it from, I can't remember her name, Juliet Wheatley at the time. But yes, it's probably a little bit more complicated than that. But that was the general, because we were very interested to know.
Yeah. It's good to have an proper expert in the room, isn't it? It's, you know, I'm immensely grateful to you for the work that you're doing with Virgin on Wild. And yeah, it is fantastic.
Sorry, can I just ask, do you have what I want is a little leaflet that explains to my neighbours why cutting their verges. I can say what I think, but if it came from a group and that said this is why mowing your verges is rather bad news, it would be quite helpful.
And the council should be able to pay for that.
Okay, we haven't got it. We have got a web page, which is on the Herefordshire Wildlife Trust website. So, we're not very good with technology.
I'm tempted to encourage you all to look at the Climate and Nature Grants Scheme, Community Grants Scheme, as a source of funding for a bit of comms work on verges. Yeah, because the council can't do everything, but if
So Plant Life have got loads of information up on their website. So Plant Life, we can lift something off there very easily.
One more question?
Yeah, Ellie, just a little personal thing really, wishing you well in Glasgow. As it happens, Rick and I, and maybe some others in the room, were in Paris for COP21 on a Friends of the Earth Eurostar trip. And at the end, it was relatively, as you know, successful. It's achieved a bit, COP21, which is, we hope, going to be followed through COP26. At the end, the French Prime Minister, who was the president of COP21, said, surrounded by all the United Nations people and the good and the great on television, I was watching them at a friend's house in Paris, he thanked everyone for what had been achieved, so-and-so, so-and-so, et aussi les militants, and also the militants. And so the actual Prime Minister was acknowledging that the militants on the street had helped push things through. So so you're going to be on the streets of
Glasgow. Not quite as glamorous, but quite a lot colder. But yes, thanks.
Well, we'll draw it to a close now. I'm sure if there are individual questions, then Ellie will be willing to answer them while we're sort of tidying up and so on. But thank you so much.
Thank you.
I mean, you've had some appreciative comments all the way through, but the breadth of knowledge and the enthusiasm have been very sort of heartening. Thank you so much for coming and sharing that with us. I think you can tell everyone's appreciated it.